The Journey of Truth and Justice, a struggle between power and fairness. In the heart of the southern countryside, the town of Willow Creek thrived on traditions, whispers, and a strict hierarchy that favored the powerful. At the top of this chain stood Edward Graves, a wealthy landowner who had inherited his fortune and power from generations before him. Known for his cunning and ruthlessness, Edward was a man who didn't just own land, he owned influence, people, and, some believed, the law itself. But this story wasn't about Edward Graves alone. It was also about Samuel Carter, a hard-working black farmer whose small piece of land was a symbol of resilience and pride. Samuel had inherited the land from his father, who had fought hard to buy it after emancipation. The Carters' farm wasn't big or luxurious, but it was theirs, a beacon of independence in a town where such things were rare for people like them. The quiet balance of Willow Creek shattered one evening when Edward Graves accused Samuel of stealing cattle from his property. The news spread like wildfire. Edward's accusations weren't just words, they were an unspoken command to the town. His connections ensured that the sheriff arrested Samuel without delay, dragging him away from his family and farm. The accusation was absurd to those who knew Samuel. He was a man of principle, a devout churchgoer, and someone who barely left his farm except to sell his crops at the market. But none of that mattered to Edward or the system that thrived on keeping men like Samuel in their place. The trial began, and presiding over it was Judge Harold Whitmore, a man whose reputation as a fair and just official had been unchallenged for years. Yet, Harold knew this case would test not just his knowledge of the law but his very soul. Edward had already sent subtle messages, threats disguised as reminders of loyalty. "You owe this town everything," one note read, hinting at the political connections that had once helped Harold rise. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Edward, with his polished lawyers and fabricated evidence, sat smugly. Samuel, shackled and weary, stood with his only ally, his daughter, Clara Carter. Clara was no ordinary advocate. She was studying law at a university up north, a rarity for women of her background. Her sharp mind and fiery determination were well known in Willow Creek, and she was prepared to fight for her father's innocence, no matter the odds. Clara began her defense with precision and passion. She called on witnesses who could confirm Samuel's alibi. The blacksmith testified that Samuel was repairing tools at his shop the evening of the alleged theft. Clara presented a ledger showing the exact time Samuel had purchased supplies at the general store. She even managed to produce an anonymous letter, hinting that Edward's men had staged the theft to frame Samuel. But Edward was relentless. He leaned on his power, intimidating witnesses and influencing the jury. One by one, key witnesses began to falter on the stand, their voices shaking with fear. The jury, made up of Edward's allies and townsfolk too afraid to cross him, seemed to favor the wealthy landowner despite Clara's airtight arguments. Judge Whitmore observed all of this with a heavy heart. He could feel the weight of the town's expectations pressing down on him. As much as he wanted to side with the truth, he knew the repercussions of ruling against Edward. His career, his reputation, even his family's safety, everything was at stake. Late one night, as the trial reached its climax, Judge Whitmore sat alone in his chambers. The faces of Samuel and Clara haunted him. He thought of his father, a lawyer who had dedicated his life to fighting for justice during the civil rights movement. His father's words echoed in his mind: "The law is not just ink on paper. It is the voice of the voiceless, the shield of the powerless." The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The town had come to witness the verdict, and the tension was suffocating. Judge Whitmore began his ruling with a firm but calm voice. "This court exists to uphold the truth," he said, his gaze shifting between Edward and the jury. "No man, regardless of wealth or influence, stands above the law. The evidence presented proves beyond a doubt that Samuel Carter is innocent." Gasps echoed through the room. Judge Whitmore wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "this court finds sufficient cause to investigate the actions of Edward Graves and his associates regarding this false accusation." Edward's face turned red with fury, but he said nothing. He stormed out of the courtroom, leaving behind an air of defeated arrogance. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, some relieved, others fearful of Edward's retaliation. For Samuel and Clara, it was a victory that went beyond the trial. It was a moment of justice in a world that so often denied it. As father and daughter embraced, the weight of the ordeal lifted, replaced by hope and resilience. Judge Whitmore knew the consequences of his decision would be severe. Edward would undoubtedly try to ruin him, but for the first time in years, Harold felt at peace. He had chosen the path of truth, a path his father would have been proud of. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Willow Creek felt different. The air was heavy with change, as if the verdict had planted a seed of courage in the hearts of the oppressed. The journey of truth and justice was far from over, but in that small town, for that one moment, fairness had triumphed over power.